Josef Vogl is next, please.
Thank you very much to the INET team for the invitation. Thank you to Uwe Heuser for the introduction. And I apologize for my English. The next 15 minutes would be a very difficult experience for you, but also for me. My remarks on financial markets and the financial crisis do not make any claims to originality. First of all, I would like to just remember, that since 2007 and 2008, the crisis has undergone various phases that document an escalation of the situation as a whole. It began as a crisis of private debt, a collapse of the American home mortgage market. Then it became a dramatic problem of global liquidity that led to a crisis of public budgets, to a crisis of sovereign debt. And now, and this is also Joschka Fischer's thesis, in the most recent turn, we have arrived at a situation which one could describe as a sclerosis in political decision making. We are faced with a crisis of governance, with an unclear distribution of responsibilities among instances of political power, economic actors, democratic procedures, and the role of civil society. The turbulence of financial markets has become a crisis of the entire capitalist system, including its political institutions and legal foundations. This political sclerosis is even more remarkable, considering that the final decision, the restoring of the system, is foreseeable. The financial markets were or are being refinanced through bailout packages, cheap money, and deficit breaks. Despite all appearances, the recent collapse of the finance economy does not represent the end of an era. The crisis has proved itself as a way to solidify the existing economic order. Nevertheless, between the collapse and the restart, certain mechanisms, malfunctions, and flaws, which belong to the basic elements of the global finance economy, have become visible. Europe, with its tension between elected governments, national sovereignties, European institutions, and transnational networks, is probably the ideal setting for this situation. Here, we may realize the distortions and breaking points that will determine future political fights. Against this backdrop, I would like to take a look at the changes in the power relations in the economic regime, and I will try to give some historical context to the current situation. To this end, please allow me to formulate three brief theses. First, from the hectic negotiations over bailout of Lehman Brothers in September 2008 to the recent choreography of European crisis politics, one can recognize that political decision-making is becoming informal in its procedures, instances, and authorities. Improvised meetings, governance panels, troikas, or mercosys have taken over government business and are legitimated solely by extraordinary events and exceptional circumstances. Obscure decision-making paths are combined with actual solutions in which the welfare of one group or another is sacrificed to some idea of the general interest. One can recognize here a classic type of political action that not only has its roots in the old field of state reason, raison d'etat, but also corresponds to Gabriel Naudet's canonical definition of a coup d'etat. In his Considération politique sur le coup d'etat from 1639, Naudet was concerned with political situations of high political pressure that demand immediate, singular, and bold action by the ruler. This intervention is urgent because of the casus extremis necessitate, a state of emergency in which the particular circumstances dictate the actions to be taken. Such coups d'etats do not intend to overthrow the existing order, but rather to conserve it when faced with a situation in which, I quote, legal considerations are no longer called for, but only the appropriate means in particular case to achieve a particular goal. Facing the current situation, one can argue that the economic state of emergency in recent years have given rise to a form of government action that resembles a continuous coup d'etat. This provisional politics has four main characteristics. First of all, it operates in a rule-free space in which political action, justified by the situation, draws a range of possibilities that are legally undefined and produces results that are neither controllable nor revisable. Second, time pressure dictates this politics in such a way that a fundamental difference in mobility becomes apparent. On the one side stands the dictate of the short term that corresponds to the dynamics of the financial world. On the other, the slow deliberation of democracy and civil society. Third, a dilemma emerges from this difference. The goal setting of extraordinary measures collides with the norms of the political system itself. This dilemma leaves its marks to the so-called market-conform democracy, a wonderful title invented by our Chancellor Merkel, and touches on fundamental questions of legitimacy. Fourth and finally, this practice of governance is defined by informal politico-economic consortia. They operate, as I would say, as welfare committees or finance soviets and become increasingly sovereign in their executive power. Second thesis. Under such circumstances, it makes little sense to conceive the state and the market politics and economics as opposites or antipodes. On the contrary, to claim such oppositions would distort our view of both the practice of governance and economic mechanisms. The opposition of the state and the market system does not do justice to the anatomy of the current crisis. One may recall the rise of contemporary financial markets, which only succeeded because of the vehement political interventions since the Thatcher and Reagan era. Or one may think of September 11, 1973, that day when a military putsch in Chile brought forth the two-sided figure of authoritarian government and market liberalism. Above all, however, one must understand that modern governance emerged as the introduction of economics into the sphere of politics. Since the formation of European territorial states, economy defined the main issues of government. The concept of economy, which once meant the divine rule over the world, a sort of theological business management, has encompassed, since the early modern period, the totality of government action. Good government is, since the 17th century, economic governance. It is concerned with the construction of a continuous space in which the transitions from sovereign power to the concrete practice of ruling and to the regulation of social dynamics can be organized. What is needed now is a stereoscopic perspective that can follow the co-evolution of states and markets, and an interaction that is also documented in the genesis of political economy and liberal doctrines. What we call today economic liberalism and what has determined economic policy in the recent decades has never limited itself to the protection of market mechanisms and mere economic processes. Since the 18th century, the goal has been rather to govern the entire social field with the help of economic principles. A transformation of control and command structures was called for, a call to transfer the responsibilities of indirect governance to the market. Liberalism cannot be separated from a type of government that hopes, through the establishment of the markets, to realize figures of social order and to optimize the practice of governance. It should come as no surprise then that since the 1980s, since the time when global finance economy was established, some, like Gary Becker, have demanded, I quote, an economic imperialism, which means the extension of the economic approach to all areas of social life, you know this, education, health, family, friendship, criminality. The intent was, and this is important, the elimination of the difference between society and economy, the dispersion of micro-markets and competition over and across the flesh of society. And finally, in the spirit of a new public management, the market itself was presupposed even as a model for the political being. The question of governance is thus related to the functioning of, and this is important for me, of the functioning of a bipolar machine in which economic dynamics and the structures of the state operate upon and influence each other. A last and third thesis, I try to be very short, sorry for this. In reaction to this linkage between politics and the markets, political power relations have undergone a drastic reorganization since the 1970s. The liberalization of financial markets has intensified the mutual dependence of nation states and global markets and has resulted in the financialization of government structures. This can be seen above all in the role of central banks, which, since their establishment in the 17th and 18th century, have created a structural coupling between the economy and politics and have performed an essential function in the dynamics of finance capitalist modernizations. Like the Bank of England, or much more later, Federal Reserve, central banks were often founded as private banks, as private institutions that received a monopoly over the creation of money, the issue of banknotes, the generation of liquidity. Despite their legal independence, they function as public-private hybrids, which, by selling sovereign debt, perform the systematic transformation of money into capital. One can call this the birth of Western national economies from the spirit of credit economy. Administered by central banks, sovereign debt became the basis for the financing of colonial and imperial projects. And because of this, contemporary observers already saw the central banks as a substitution for sovereign power. For example, commentators around 1800 writing about the Bank of England saw that at the heart of a state there stood neither a king nor a parliament nor a government, but rather a bank. I quote, as the center of the state, the palladium of state welfare and the personality of all persons. Such comment articulate the idea that modern state power would less define itself through sovereign potestas than it would measure itself according to its regulation of credit and capital flows. This transfer of power to central banks is characteristic for modern finance capitalism. Certainly, here as well, a radical change can be registered that began with the end of the Bretton Woods Agreement and applies to the interaction of states and markets. Floating exchange rates, the deregulation of financial markets, and the so-called derivative revolution have created a situation that is characterized by the, and this is important, by the migration of the monopoly on liquidity from central banks to the financial markets. New resources for money creation have been discovered in the form of finance, derivatives, and securitizations. These financial instruments do not just make all possible types of capital comparable, they have become, as money surrogates, a form of second-order currency. As part of the money supply in circulation, they guarantee the highest levels of liquidity and perfect the logic of modern capital and credit economy. The new foundation of money and currencies is based now on the trading of financial products. This means, first of all, that the border dividing money and capital has disappeared, that the money supply is no longer limited by the amount of existing money and no longer definable by the quantities from M1 to M3. Since every financial asset can be used directed for financial purposes, the baseline of determinable money supplies has become an illusion. The monetarist policies of central banks have reached their limit. The uncontrollability of circulating money supplies goes hand in hand with the privatization of liquidity generation. This implies, finally, the shifting of governmental power, the financialization of political structures, the mediation between public and private debts have mechanized political decisions as market-driven decisions. The market themselves have become a sort of creditor god, whose final authority decides the fate of currencies, social systems, public infrastructures, private savings, and so on. A last minute, just to summarize. The analysis of contemporary financial markets and financial crisis demands a perspective that takes into account the change in power relations and hence the entanglement of political and economic operations. Neither the state nor the market nor the opposition of both can lay claim to a theoretical privilege. Rather, what is needed is the reconstruction of a diagram in which sovereign power, institutions, concrete practices of governance, and market systems all interact. Here, the relation between the production of value and the organization of power is at stake. This would make visible a development that is characterized by a co-evolution of states and markets, developments that has led, since the deregulation of financial markets, to the intensification of such mutual dependencies. I would like to speak here of the birth of a bipolar machine whose dynamic produces uncontrollable sovereignty effects. This pertains to how political decisions have become informal, legitimated by the dictate of economic dangers and exceptional situations. With the new characteristics of liquidity and debt circulation, moreover, the courses of political action have been delegated to financial markets where they have become mechanized or automatic. If it is true that the instruments and the connectivity of financial systems continue to undermine their stability, then this potential for insecurity will be confirmed as a decisive power by the most recent measures like the fiscal pact and deficit brake, and indeed transported into the center of government institutions, especially since all other attempts of regulation have been failed. Future policy will therefore have to be measured according to two simple questions. I'm going to end. First, how can democratic procedures intervene in imperatives of the politico-economic machine? And second, how can public goods, including liquidity avoid being confiscated by the global financial economy. Thank you for your superhuman patience.
Thank you very much, Josef Vogl.